And we're back, finally. Hopefully this microphone is working. It looks like it's flashing. Okay. Hello, British and American culture students. This week, our lecture was delayed for a specific reason. That is, we had a quiz on Thursday, and there were 3 classes that were combined for the information for that quiz. So I thought it was better not to throw in a new lecture before you wrote the quiz. So yesterday, um, most students wrote the quiz. We're still getting about an 80% turnout. And quite frankly, students skip quizzes all the time. Some people are sick, some people forget, or they're late. It happens. But usually the number's around 90% who take it. So I'm not concerned that a few people are missing it, but just that too many people are. So it looks like most of you have figured it out, but there's a few people that are still submitting at the last minute. I got an email Thursday afternoon. A student said, Professor, I tried to submit 14 seconds after 10:10, and I couldn't. And I said, right, you can't. That's all I can say. I've said it the entire semester. You have to hand it in before 10:10. 1 second late, there's nothing I can do. I can't see your answers. You get 0. Okay? Now, please just do it at 10:09. It's not supposed to be like who can get the. It's not like pumping gas into a car where you want to get it exactly on $20, and if you're one under, then you lose. Okay? You can just put $19 of gas in the tank and it's fine. Maybe that's a bad metaphor for students who don't drive cars. But anyway, don't try and hit the number exactly. As soon as you're done the form, don't use the whole 10 minutes. It's just there to prevent you from searching on the internet or using your book too much. All right? So just use 9 minutes and submit it. Don't go to the 10th minute, or you might get a 0 instead of what you deserve. That's all I have to say. So I don't expect any more emails to that effect because there's nothing I can do. However, one student did tell me, and she took screenshots of her laptop wasn't working and her phone wasn't working. I don't know why that would be the case unless you have internet problems. She couldn't access the portal. I've never had this problem ever. There's only problems with the CNU portal if there's maintenance or the server's overloaded. But that doesn't happen this semester because they've upgraded the system. So there shouldn't be any problems. She did have a problem though, and she took a picture. So her suggestion was, could you please send the link to the form by email as well, or instead. But the problem is some students still haven't put their correct email. There's a couple students in this class who don't have their email even uploaded to their profile on the CNU portal. So like when I send a group email, some students don't get it because it's the wrong email address, or you don't check it, or it's not there. So I'm going to do both, all right? I'm going to send a scheduled email. Quiz number 5 is next Thursday. Next Thursday is November 19th. It's quiz number 5. At 10 o'clock, you will get an email that has a link to the form, okay? It's the way you're supposed to do it is through the CNU portal. But just in case there's an issue, you can open up your email and access the form through there. Click on it, finish it, submit it. Do not submit 2 forms. Do not submit one. It's the same form. It's just a different access point. We'll try this I feel bad for the student who couldn't open the quiz. So this is her idea and we're going to try it. So you have 2 options. Don't do both. Don't submit 2 quizzes. I know there's going to be somebody who does this anyway, but I'm not going to count 2. I'm going to count the lower score of the 2 of them. So do it through the CNU portal. All of you, it's been working fine. I've tested it over and over again. I can do it on my phone. I can do it on a tablet. I can do it on my computer. No problem. If you have an issue with the CNU portal, open up your email on your phone, click on the link, do your quiz, submit it. That's the backup plan, okay? There should be no more complaints from anyone. let's talk about industrialization and imperialism. Okay, so this is the content for next week. This is this week's lecture, although it'll probably be uploaded Friday night. This is for this week, but this is the content for Friday's quiz number 5, November 19th. Thursday, 10 o'clock, we have another quiz. Okay, there's 2 left. We're doing number 5. So all of the stuff I do in this lecture and the next one will be on quiz number 5. So we're not confusing quizzes and lectures, okay? So everything I talk about today and the next one, prepare it for the quiz. Imperialism first. So we're on chapter 5. One of the biggest legacies of British culture is its imperial legacy. The British Empire was called the empire that never sets, because at any point in time, the sun would be up somewhere in the British Empire. When the sun is down in Canada, it's up in Australia, right? When the sun is going down in Africa, it's coming up in the East Coast. It was a global empire, and it wasn't the first global empire. And of course, not surprisingly, we stole that. I shouldn't say we, because I'm not a British. I'm descended from the people who said the sun never sets on the British Empire, but that actually was an expression coined by the Spanish, because they were the first truly global empire, and they had an empire that never set, with their holdings in South America, in the Philippines, in India, when Portugal was part of their empire, and parts of Italy and Germany. They had territory across the entire world. So it was originally their expression, but we stole it. The British stole it, not me. Imperialism is the idea of a country or kingdom of people extending its power or dominating other territories through colonialism, exploitation of resources, and military power. Right there, the first line on page 151. Highlight that. That's going to be on the test. Okay, you need to know what imperialism is. The British had a particular type of imperialism, but all Western imperialism was sort of descended from the Roman Empire. So the Romans, what they did is they started with one city, and they gradually consolidated all of Italy. And then they had a sort of Mediterranean world war with Carthage. And when they defeated Carthage, they took control of basically the entire Mediterranean basin. And from there, they expanded northward and eastward and westward until they ended up in Britannia, in Britain eventually, and all the way to Syria and Mesopotamia in the east. Their expansion was, the justification for the Roman expansion was, there was an empire of self-defense. Right, so on every time they defeated an enemy, because originally they were fighting with cities in Italy that were enemies. As soon as they defeated those cities, there was another border with another, sometimes even more threatening people or culture or kingdom or tribes. Gaul being one of them, Carthage the other. As soon as they took over all of Italy and started trading in the Mediterranean, there was this enormous, powerful, rich North African empire that was rubbing up against their territory. And they started fighting with them. And in order to protect themselves, they had to destroy the Carthaginian Empire. To a certain extent, the British start doing the same sort of thing. The Irish are the ones who are the first victims of this sort of policy, is that we can't leave Ireland alone because Ireland is too dangerous, right? Scotland's the same. They keep fighting with Scotland because Scotland keeps making friends with France. And France is a powerful country, a kingdom that could do damage. So, the solution to the Scottish is to make war with them and defend themselves and eventually unify and make one kingdom out of two. Then they don't have to worry about the French stabbing them in the back. But Ireland is different because it's not connected by land. They have a different kind of religion because they're Catholic. And they don't think, they don't have the same, system of government or history of interaction. They don't have the same king. They don't have intermarriage between any of their kings and the King of England. And this is partly because Ireland really never becomes unified. It's usually got multiple kings and multiple leaders, and they often fight with each other. So it wasn't, I'm not going to say it wasn't hard, but it made it easier for the English to invade and conquer pieces of Ireland, because the Irish were always fighting amongst themselves. If they had unified and organized themselves under one strong leader, who knows what history would have been like. But that's not what they did. They were fiercely independent, very tough people, and very very proud of their culture, and I would say some English stereotypes paint them as lazy or temperamental. I would say that's just propaganda, and that's just that's an attempt by the British to justify taking them over and making them work harder and controlling their culture. They have a very vibrant culture. Irish people love dancing and singing. They love education. They're very energetic, and they're very independent and proud, and they're tough. They're not the type of people that are easily going to be controlled. But the English, starting with basically Henry II, this is like 800 years ago, the English were constantly interfering with them. And eventually, when you get up to the 16th century, Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, and then Cromwell finally, it continues. They invade, and then they begin colonizing. Queen Elizabeth starts the Ulster Plantation, which is Scots and English people coming over and mixing with the Irish. So we end up with this Scots-Irish, enclave in the northern part of Ireland. And this is called the Pale, which is where you get the expression beyond the Pale. Within the Pale was English rule, which was organized and safe. And beyond the Pale was where the Irish rule, and where it was more dangerous and less stable, you would say. So if you go beyond the Pale, a thief, a brigand, an Irish person might attack you, or maybe not, but that's not the area that was controlled. So beyond the Pale means something unknown, or something, sometimes it means something dangerous or unstable. So obviously the Irish people, first of all, even today are very bitter about this, and you might wonder why Northern Ireland is still part of the UK. Well, Ireland is a republic that's independent. Well, that's the reason, because 400 years ago, a plantation was created of Protestant Scots and English, and they mixed with Irish Protestants and converted Irish people, and you ended up with a Scots-Irish, English, territory in the north that still had its Irish character, but was kind of a subculture of the UK. And when Ireland finally got its independence, those 6 counties, with Ulster as the capital, remained part of the UK. And understandably, the Irish who live in the Republic still feel like that land belongs to them, and that it should be part of the Irish Republic. We won't get into that too much, but all of these things are connected. It's like an 800-year-old history, but if you want to condense it, maybe 400 years of tension between Ireland and England, and then the United Kingdom. It's only within the last 2 generations, about 50 years, not even, where the bombing and terrorism and threats and political problems have been subdued. And I mean, that gives us hope. Ultimately, my personal belief is that Ireland should be consolidated, just the way North Korea and South Korea should be consolidated. But it's very tricky to work out the details, so it's hard to imagine how that would make everybody happy. So it hasn't happened yet. But at least they're living relatively peacefully compared to the violence that has gone on for hundreds of years there. I told you about Cromwell being a crazy religious fanatic, and the fact that he looked down upon Irish people, as a lower form of human, plus they were Catholic. He felt gave him license to kill them whenever he wanted it, and not to treat them fairly. So this is the dress rehearsal for imperialism, and it highlights the brutal, terrible aspect of imperialism, and how at its very core, what imperialism does is exploit people, right? And that you're kind of, we don't really call it a war crime, but inevitably, uh, imperial rule, if the people are not willing, they're not, like, there were cases in the Roman Empire where, a kingdom actually ceased to exist and it sort of bequeathed itself. When the king died, he gave all of his wealth and his kingdom to, it's like a donation to the Roman Empire. That is a possibility. And there were petitions to join the British Empire, right? There were countries that wanted to join the British Empire, and there have been countries, territories that have petitioned to join the United States, and the United States has rejected some of them. That's another story, but that's not the same as going to another country, another people, another region, and imposing yourself on them. If the people there are not inviting you in, you're an imperialist, right? William of Orange was invited to England, and he assumed the throne, and he was accepted by the English people, even though he was Dutch and he had a Dutch army. But those Dutch people, those mercenaries and Germans and English and French and the local people, for the most part, just blended together. And he was not, although he brought a dominant culture with him, he quickly subsumed into the British culture, and he became a part of it. And so did anybody who stayed in England. So they just got absorbed. That's not what imperialism does. Imperialism imposes cultural ideas and power and control from another place on the region that is being subjected. So in the book, I have described the negative things, because I've just described how Ireland has been treated. This is the way that the Japanese treated the Koreans as well. They looked at Koreans as a lesser Asian race, and that the Japanese were superior, and that their language was superior, their culture, their education, their technology, their physical ability, their morality. That's the way not all of them, but there was this, theory and this belief amongst the soldiers and the political elite that Japanese culture was superior, and so that they should make Korea like a little Japan, right? And that's what the British attitude was like too. The Victorians believed that they were superior religiously, morally, racially, intellectually, technologically, and that when they went to another country, they were going to bring their higher level civilization there too. And if they didn't like it, that's too bad. So imagine that Japan had come, and my favorite Korean hero, of course, is Lee Sun-shin. Imagine Lee Sun-shin had failed, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi's navy had made it around the peninsula and into the China Sea and resupplied the Japanese army at Pyongyang, and that army had made it into China, and all of Korea had fallen because Lee Sun-shin was unable to stop the Japanese ships. Can you imagine that perhaps China would have won, but maybe Japan would have maintained a foothold in Busan, or they may have made a treaty with China, because China would have been exhausted by fighting, this war and run out of money. They were not very organized at the time. Their army was not nearly as good as the Japanese. They might have cut a deal and left Gyeongsang as a Japanese enclave. And that Busan, Gyeongsang area would have gradually became more and more Japanese. Still Korean, but that's what Northern Ireland is. Imagine that the Japanese never left. Busan has a small Japanese influence anyway because of its trade and influence and proximity. But imagine the Japanese never left, and they sent more Japanese there. Gyeongsang that province would have a really distinct Japanese character, and it would be part of Japan, and all of Korea would be trying to convert it or to get it back. That's what Northern Ireland is. Okay, so there are some. I think there are some parallels that run through Irish, experience of colonialism and Korean experience, except the Irish experience, quite frankly, is much worse because it's 400 years long, not 40, 50 years long. Just the simple length of time and the number of people that were affected. So, strangely enough, there are going to be benefits to talk about. In the textbook, the benefits are listed first. But since I talked about Ireland, I would like to stress the negative effects first. So first, what they do as the imperialists, they want the resources in the land. So in Ireland, what they did is they owned the land. They took it from the Irish people. The Irish Catholics lost their land. Protestant landlords owned it, and all the stuff that was grown or extracted or chopped down or mined on that land belonged to them. So appropriation of local resources and taxes on goods, that's right up there, and one of the bad things for the region. They lose their resources to another country, and they don't get very much out of it, except for a job to keep themselves alive. But they don't get wealth from it. Another problem is this foreign power is going to control the state, and they're probably going to have soldiers, a military, and so you're constantly under a threat of force. Having no self-determination as a sovereign state of territory means that, you're not a country anymore. You're a territory that belongs to another place, and you don't have representation. That was one of the things about the American colonies that caused them to rebel against the British Empire, was the fact that they didn't want to be a territory, right? They didn't actually have people in Parliament to represent them. So they were essentially like this, they were a colony, but not that different than another place that was ruled like a colony in India or Singapore. They also didn't have representation, and those places would have been considered, under imperial rule. That they wanted to be part of the system, but they were not. Had the British government been smarter and let them elect members of parliament, who knows, maybe the American state would have gone a totally different direction, but that's a what if. So that goes hand in hand. They don't get to decide things for themselves. They don't have political representation in the main government towards whoever's in charge, the government or the king, the leader. Often they can't use their native language, and they have to learn another language in order to communicate and get educated. Art and music and all sorts of design, that their value is low compared to the creations, the artistic creations of the dominant culture in the imperial power. So African art is a typical one. It's not a painting of a famous princess on a wall or a king standing, with fancy curtains and a throne behind him, painted by a master on oil canvas. So it's an elaborate sculpture made of an animal out of bone or ebony or blackwood or something like that. And so that's worth very little, whereas this painting that you hang on a wall is worth millions of dollars. That's obviously a very subjective thing, and that's imperialist as well. People talk about this all the time, how all of our expensive art is from the same place. Imperial powers, the European countries. The creation of laws enforced by, so all your laws and the way your society is organized is also not your own choice. It's controlled by the imperial power. Okay, so obviously my opinion and most people's opinion is imperialism is bad. However, if you're an imperialist and you're not a horrible person and you do care about the people that you are mixing with, teaching, employing, trading with, guarding, protecting, whatever, you have to make some sort of argument. And there were many arguments, Christian missions was one of them. I mean, that's how contact was initially made with Korea and Japan too, as missionaries came over and they were trying to teach Christianity to the people that didn't know about it. But again, that is a part of imperialism too, is the fact that you think that your beliefs and your organized religion is superior to the one in that region. And that's why there's so many Christians in Korea today, is because there was an active, especially Americans, there was an active mission here. And when Japan didn't accept the missions and didn't become Christian, and the Christians were helping Koreans, that just kind of snowballed the whole process of Christianization of Koreans, because the missions do help people. They do treat sick people. They do teach people how to read. They do bring good things, but you know, it is part of the system, right? They don't come by themselves, and they don't come with ideas that are separated completely from imperialism, including ideas like colonization and racism. When they come to a place in South America or Africa, you know, the object is to Christianize the people and build a church, and a church that looks on the inside and outside like one from Europe. And like, that church doesn't really belong in Africa, it belongs in Europe. You're placing some religious values and aesthetic values in a place where it doesn't belong. And why are you doing that? Because you believe it's better. This is how they justify these kind of things. Helping the culture, helping them advance, giving them technology, these are all in the list. So this is the justification of, and the Victorians were obsessed with these things. Lots of Victorians thought they were, you know, and the Americans sometimes think this too. Like when they go to Iraq and they have a war, and they kill people and they blow stuff up, sometimes they believe that they're bringing democracy to Iraq and they're improving society, and they're giving them new technology and they're advancing it, because they think the American way of doing things is better. And if they bring it to the Iraqis, whether they want to have it or not, that they're making their lives better. And I mean, people, you can see that. I don't think most South Koreans, usually I ask the class, what do you think about, you know, had the United States not come here with the United Nations and fought in the Korean War, and then, you know, been intimately involved with politics and commercial, technological, industrial development to create Korea what it is. This is a society that has been nurtured by American culture. It's a hybrid. I love this country, but it's not very similar to what you see 50 years ago, and it's a completely different environment to what it looked like 100 years ago. Now, the whole world has changed, and globalization and all that stuff too. But American culture was a large part of that, and the presence of the Americans here, although you wouldn't call them imperialist, the simple presence of the military and the interaction politically and internationally between Koreans and Americans, developing relationships and businesses, sort of gradually turned Korea into an Americanized state. I'm very aware of this because Canada is the most Americanized country in the world. Sometimes people can't tell the difference between us. We're so Americanized. So I'm not saying this is a bad thing or a good thing. Americans would say it was a good thing, but sometimes Koreans think it's too much. Too much American stuff is not good. We're losing our identity. This is a kind of soft version of what we're talking about here, which is a forceful change. Lots of Koreans chose to wear certain types of clothes or wanted things that Americans had. They wanted wealth, they wanted better houses and vehicles and stuff, but not all of these things are conscious choices, and some of them are forced change. So Victorians thought that you should change one way or another. Your choice, actively, just it changes over time and you don't notice. That's good too. And if you really resist, then we're going to have to do something about it. So this is how they wanted people to change. They wanted global peace, right? If anybody was going to fight a war, then they got to get permission, or at least the British are going to mediate, or they're going to use their sea power to try and interfere with supplies and different countries making war on each other. So from 1815, the end of Napoleon's last attempt at Waterloo to become the emperor of Europe again, until 1914, there were sporadic wars, but nothing like a world war, nothing like a Napoleon type war or the 7 Years' War. There wasn't a war for 99 years. There wasn't a war on that scale, and part of the reason was because the British Empire controlled so much of the ocean and had so much influence over trade. So they were the moderators. They were the great world police. We call this period the Pax Britannica because of that, which means British peace. So they created a period of relative global peace with no major outbreaks of war amongst the world's most powerful states, arguably the best point. They did facilitate global trade. There's other benefits we'll talk about later, including globalization, although there are advantages and disadvantages to that also. They provided protection from attack and security provided by the Royal Navy and British garrisons. Like in America, they did protect them from the French, but the colonists were not that grateful when they got taxed. So if the British were in control of your country, like Canada, or they were in control of your country, your territory in India, and another foreign country tried to attack, they would fight and protect you. And they were paying for the soldiers for the most part, although your country was doing work and sending resources. So in essence, you were paying for it anyway. They kept the sea lanes open and protected, trade was easier because, there's always ships trying to attack and there's pirates and danger on the ocean. But having so many British ships and a gigantic navy stabilized that environment. So there were the possibility of being attacked by pirates dropped significantly. They would bring technology, science, education, philosophy all over the world. Arguably, again, some people wouldn't want those things, but they bring them anyway. I'm sure that the natives would have preferred not to have guns, but they needed them because they needed to use them to shoot at the British. They traded for guns whenever they could because they knew that was a better weapon to fight with. But they would have preferred the British to come with no guns at all, so everybody would just use arrows, and then they wouldn't be at a disadvantage. So technology obviously is a double-edged sword in most cases. They also provided access to art and literature and the most sophisticated civilization in the world. Now that is a very Victorian point of view, and an Irish person would certainly tell you, say a bad word to you if you mentioned that the British had brought any sort of sophisticated civilization to Ireland. They would say that's nonsense, and they would say much worse, use much worse language than that. I have Irish friends, and I'm descended from Irish people as well, being a Sullivan. So that is imperialism. Remember those things, the good side and the bad side, and the justification for doing it. Second part of the lecture today, industrialization. Now, I think out of all the things that the British have done, imperialism is probably a close second, but the most significant impact of the British on the world is the Industrial Revolution. The first country in the world to industrialize was the United Kingdom. And in this point, it includes Scotland too. And many of the great inventors, intellectuals, engineers were Scottish. It's not a coincidence that on the Star Trek Enterprise, you probably never heard of it, but there was some movies and there's many series over the years of a spaceship flying, exploring into space. At that point, the world is unified. It's called the Federation, and there's a ship that's named after an aircraft carrier called the Starship Enterprise. You can just search Google Starship Enterprise. It looks like a big saucer attached to a spaceship. It flies in around the universe, galaxy, looking for new life, exploring new planets. And we'll come back to Star Trek because it's kind of related to the frontier of the American Wild West in a way. But basically, this crew was a specially selected group. Some of them are aliens, androids, charismatic captain, warlike aliens, and females and males and all kinds of stuff. But the guy who's the engineer, this guy, I think he's actually in real life, he's Welsh, the first guy. but his name in the show, the engineer who always fixes the ship whenever it's broken, his name is Scotty. Okay, and that's not a coincidence, because quite often the engineer who fixed the locomotive or was fixing machines was a Scot, was a Scottish. The Scottish were a disproportionately talented group of people. It's not genetic. I guess it's environmental. I don't think Scottish people do better on IQ tests or anything. They're very tough people, and they live a hard life, and they work hard, and they learn to read. They had started printing Bibles, and they became one of the most literate, hardworking, influential groups of people in the Renaissance, in the Reformation. Sorry, there's a Scottish Renaissance too, but after the Reformation, there's an Enlightenment, and this is a period of intellectual development when people start experimenting and they start applying the scientific method. John Locke, Rousseau, and Newton, who we talked about, people start taking these ideas and applying them, and this is physics is born, engineering becomes a thing, and Scottish people, for whatever reason, they're very involved in a lot of these Enlightenment subjects, and they're very sought after for their engineering skill, their mechanical skill. So the thing that you need for we're not really going to have time to talk about why did it happen in the United Kingdom, but I think empire is one of the reasons it did. What you need is a lot of resources coming in. You need surpluses, so you have labor, right? They had not enough. I mean, technology there's an agricultural revolution, that the second agricultural revolution improves the tools and the techniques for growing food. So first of all, you have a food surplus, and that food surplus gives you more resources so that you can get more food, have a greater population, and you can have more land for one person. So then you have this kind of population pressure where there's people looking for work, and you have excess resources, and you start developing these colonies where you discover things like tobacco, sugar, coffee, and cotton. And you take these raw materials from the colonies, wherever they are, America, India, Jamaica, and other places, Canada, and you bring them back to the home country, and then you process them and you manufacture them. And, at first, of course, the flow was a trickle. There was some goods coming back, but as the colonies developed and the population rose, the demand increased and the supply increased, and then we got all of the situation started to develop where you had more people working, and with the literacy and the experimentation and the scientific ideas, people started to think that they could design a machine, right? A machine that could do things faster and better and without getting tired. It has quite a few advantages over human beings if you could make it work. So they started designing these things. And so this environment, this is the simple answer. It's not that the United Kingdom was lucky or that they're smarter or it's special or anything. It just happened that these intersection of factors occurred where ideas, higher levels of literacy, better education, resources and excess labor and surpluses of food all laid the foundation for what if there's so many resources, I have barely enough hands to get it done. What if I could use one pair of hands and a machine to do the work of 5 hands? Then how much could I make? So you got the resources, the material, and the power to get this going. So the machine needs to be made of a material. And so the iron working technology that was made in Sweden and imported to England allowed them to build these strong pieces and tools that were assembled into machines, and they could handle this work. So you got iron as the material. The resources, I said some of them already, but the most important one is cotton, because cotton is the material that when it's processed and made into thread, it can be woven into cloth. and that cloth can be bed sheets, it can be sails, it can be coats, it can be curtains, it can be tablecloths, it can be pants. Believe it or not, cotton was super expensive long time ago, before the Industrial Revolution. Now it's dirt cheap, and that's because people planted it everywhere. You know, half of the United States, huge amounts of the United States were covered in cotton plantations, and that's related to slavery as well. And then cotton started being grown in India as well. And once, you know, this very soft and flexible and useful material that could get wet and dry and could be used in almost any climate was mass produced. Rather than being more expensive than silk, which it was in ancient times, it became the cheapest material around. And that's because the British brought the cotton to England, to England and Scotland, the United Kingdom, and they designed something called the spinning jenny, where they could, you know, multiply the production of an individual. And they improved the spinning jenny into subsequent weaving machines until eventually it wasn't a factory at first, it was just one machine, one person, but it was a multiplier. So one person could do 5 times as much. And eventually they got it so like one person could do 100 times as much. And so then, you know, textiles were coming out the door as the cotton was coming in, as modern factories do. And the power. You can't have somebody running on a treadmill or something. They're going to run out of energy. The typical, for all of human history, power was generated by wind, water, right? Nature. That was the strongest power available. And if you didn't have that, then, of course, human muscle, and preferably, though, domesticated animals like an ox, a camel, a donkey, a horse. Horses were ideal because of their temperament and their flexibility and their strength. So horses were ideal, and that's why we still, to this day, we refer to the power of a car or a vehicle as a certain number of horses. Like my car is 250 horsepower. The engine has the power of 250 horses. Now, the machines, you know, the machines that they made originally were probably like 1/4 horsepower, and right, and they would fall apart all the time. There was all kinds of problems with them, but this was the start. And just think about the computer. First computer was, you know, filled an entire room, a whole floor of a building, and it has less power than, you know, my iPhone 11 has, you know, 1,000 more times computing power than that. So this is the sort of process that happened too, is that the original machines were enormous and dangerous, and they pumped smoke everywhere, but they had a lot of power, and gradually they made them smaller and stronger and safer. And so you need, for the British, the magic formula for the British Industrial Revolution, the first one in the world was cotton into textiles, cotton resources into textiles, iron machines, and the power. Steam, right? Steam powered. They discovered that they could turn a turbine if they heated water using coal and charcoal. They could burn something, heat it up, and they'd have a boiler, and the pressure from the steam would spin a turbine, and that would generate the energy and do the work. So steam is the power, iron is the material, and cotton is the resource that you put into the machine to get the product. Okay. Now there's lots of bad things about the Industrial Revolution. The type of job was very monotonous. The society was, you know, completely turned upside down because as all societies all over the world were, the majority of the people lived in the countryside. It was a rural society. That's the way it had been since forever. The urban percentage was quite low. You know, 80% of the people would live outside the city. And as industrialization occurred, the countryside emptied out, and everybody moved to the city to get jobs because agricultural revolution meant farmers could have larger areas. If you didn't have enough land, then you just sold your piece and you moved to the city and you tried to find some work. If you were lucky and you had a lot of land, you continued to farm. Or if you were rich and you owned a piece of land, then people worked on your land, but you needed less workers. So you might fire some of the farmers that are hired and they would move to the city too. So the city was the land of opportunity. It was also overpopulated, and there was not there was not a system ready for the influx of people that would move, especially to London. So London, just like in the 17th century, like James I said, London is the most disgusting, offensive place in the country. It's overpopulated and it's dirty and it's full of disease and bad behavior and poor people. And he thought it was just a terrible example of English culture. And London is the representative place of the British Empire and United Kingdom now. So it's hard to imagine that it was a garbage. According to the kings and queens, it was a bit of a garbage dump. Queen Victoria used to go to Balmoral in Scotland and her other houses and castles in the countryside a lot to get away from what we would call hustle and bustle, but not like just the traffic and the air pollution in Seoul. The traffic, the air pollution, the disease, the smell, the crowds, the dirt, the noise. It was just not a place that was relaxing at all. So we'll stop right there, because the next lecture I'm going to talk about Victorianism, and I'm going to talk about the dark side of industrialization in a little bit more detail. We'll talk about Horatio Nelson, the hero that kicked off, the Pax Britannica of the 19th century, and we'll talk about Queen Victoria herself. I've been reading a lot about her recently. I usually skip over her a bit, but this semester it's time to talk about more ladies, and so I studied about Queen Victoria the last couple weeks, and I'd like to share with you some interesting things about her character and what it was like, to be a Victorian British citizen. So you'll find, I think, there's a lot of, it's close enough to us that it's familiar, and it's far enough away that some of the things we can't believe. Okay, thank you very much. That was a pretty long lecture. You'll have to watch this over the weekend, and then there'll be another one coming Sunday night or Monday. Remember, these two lectures are week 11, and they are the content for the quiz. So make sure you read chapter 5 and listen to the lectures, and you'll be ready for quiz number 5. Same time, Thursday the 19th, 10 a.m. You can access through the scheduled email, or you can use the CNU portal. Have a good day, and see you again on Monday.